is a real Christmas one. It's been almost a year since the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th by a mob of MAGA and militias. And every day, it seems like we learn more and more about how close we were to an actual coup, an American coup. Ironically, inside America. So I guess that's progress. I don't know. But according to two authors of a new piece in Just Security, which is a national security publication, who pieced together all the testimonies from former officials, as well as many different books that have come out since January 6th, we learned that actually there is a reason that the National Guard was not called to January 6th, which I think has been the biggest question mark for a lot of us. We're like, why weren't there more police? Why wasn't there the National Guard? Why were Capitol police officers and DC Metropolitan police officers left to their own devices? Turns out there might be a very good reason. So the Pentagon's restraint in allowing the Guard to get to the Capitol was not simply a reflection of officials' misgivings about the deployment of military force during the summer of 2020. Remember Black Lives Matter and all that, where Trump wanted to call out the National Guard, nor was it simply a concern about optics of having military personnel at the Capitol. Instead, evidence is mounting that the most senior defense officials did not want to send troops to the Capitol because they harbored concerns that President Donald Trump might utilize the force's presence in attempt to hold power. Right. So basically, we're talking about one guy in particular. There were a couple of them. But one guy in particular, Christopher Miller, who served as acting Secretary of Defense on January 6th, told the department's Inspector General that he feared, quote, "If we put US military personnel on the Capitol, I would have created the greatest constitutional crisis probably since the Civil War." In congressional testimony, he said he was also cognizant of the fears that the president would invoke the Insurrection Act to politicize the military in an anti-democratic manner. And that factored into my decision regarding the appropriate and limited use of our armed forces to support civilian law enforcement during the Electoral College certification. In other words, I basically didn't want to send people who I thought could make it worse and who the president could directly employ. Unlike the DC Metropolitan Police, Trump would have control over the National Guard and could have used them to bolster the actions of the insurrectionists on January 6th. This is now becoming part of this like grand theory, this thesis. Brad, what do you think of that? That thesis.
It is okay. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of specific facts that when you come across them, you realize just how potentially like tenuously we're holding on to like an America that people the world over have grown to rely on, except for those South American countries that Francesca was referring to where we stage coups. Okay, aside from that. But on the world stage, when you think of America as like whether or not a coup would take place, you don't have to worry about it at all. Because and that especially comes from the people who are in Washington. Traditionally, there have been basically all of them look at the American Constitution and the way that power is peacefully passed from one presidency to another, and it really is a fantastic, like reliable system. But Trump's, Trump and that the kind of cynicism of our institutions that I think the founders set aside as like a healthy thing to do, where, and created a lot of channels by which theoretically at least you could express your discontent for the system as it was and affect change in it. That's a good cynicism to have. You're supposed to express it through those channels, but Trump has questioned so many of those norms. And some of the norms that we had were bad and some of them were good. I would argue that the peaceful transfer of power in America is a great norm for us to have. But by emboldening all these people and also kind of moving the discourse toward like Facebook and YouTube chat and all these online forums.
No offense.
Now you just don't know who the bad guys are. We've come a long time since back then where like the bad guys were in red coats. And now you don't know if they're on your side of the military which, by the way, the National Guard, influenced greatly by Mike Flynn's brother, who is an avid QAnoner and a guy who, has a chip on his shoulder because he got ousted from the Trump administration early on. Like, these are the issues that really led to that uncertainty, which is bad in all kinds of ways. And the more we see people piece parts of it together, the more terrifying it is, and the more I don't know what the proper solution is, because and I'm in a position where I have to look at the generals and say, hey, generals, please keep it together when they're the ones who tear other countries apart. And I don't want a military, the generals are still the military, and military does coup stuff. Right. And it's tough to sort through.
Well, yeah, and it looks like not just Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller, who was promoted after November, after Trump lost. He ousted his Secretary of Defense, Esper, and promoted Christopher Miller because he thought Miller would be more loyal to him. It turns out that was not the case. And another guy, as Brett is saying, a General Milley, who I think we've heard a lot about, actually feared that January 6th was gonna be Trump's Reichstag moment. So according to multiple reports, Milley feared it was Trump's Reichstag moment, in which, like Adolf Hitler in 1933, he would manufacture a crisis in order to swoop in and rescue the nation from it. Now, Milley was behind the scenes talking to unsavory people that we didn't have any faith in before, like Mike Pompeo, right? Or Gina Haspel, CIA director. These are people who were on board with the Trump administration and Trump plan from jump. They're like, yeah, we love locking up kids. We love increasing weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. Oh, we love them disappearing American journalists. Done. But this was a bridge too far, not agreeing to a peaceful transfer of power. And we talk about the Insurrection Act. So there was evidence, lots of evidence, that Trump was about to invoke the Insurrection Act. He wanted to do so in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter uprising. So on June 1st, the White House aides reportedly went so far as to draft a proclamation to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807, which allows the president to employ military forces to suppress major civil unrest. And then later on, and Brett referenced this a little bit earlier, but General Flynn was out in front along with a lot of other QAnon crazies, basically saying, yeah, we should do the Insurrection Act, but on January 6th. And in this case, in support of rioters. So by late December, Trump has already lost. Trump's own interest in invoking martial law was widely known. CNN reported on escalating concerns at a heated Oval Office meeting on Friday, December 18th, in which Trump heard arguments about invoking martial law to stay in office, had some Trump officials sounding the alarm to the press, noting that Michael Flynn, Trump's pardoned former national security advisor, discussed the martial law plan on right-wing television network Newsmax last week and was invited to the White House Friday. According to the New York Times, it was Trump who asked about the idea during the meeting. And again, my pillow man, like Mike Lindell's out there like, oh, what about my plan? Like they all had their own versions of just do the Insurrection Act, take control of the military. So this wasn't just a, hey, maybe, I don't know, he's not gonna go that far. No. He was absolutely planning on doing this to the point where the Secretary of Defense was like, I don't wanna give him more people at his disposal. Do you think we saved lives, Brett, by doing that? Or, we know 5 people did die. There was already violence. It's tough to imagine that it was like, at that point, folks were just like, you know what? Let's just let them get their yayas out and hope they don't come across like any lawmakers.
Yeah, I would have preferred a situation where the demonstrators stayed demonstrators and weren't rioters, and to have folks at the front, essentially keeping them out of the Capitol building. That would have been ideal. Yeah. But when you look through it, there's an op-ed in the Washington Post where it says 3 generals are warning of just how close to a coup we are, because you don't know what members of the military and whose side they're gonna come down on, but a lot of them skew Trump, which is terrifying. And I will say it now, is anti-American. It's scary when we look at who we have to rely on. We're relying on Mike Pompeo. We're relying on General Milley. We're relying on people that, I would say folks on that are closer to me on the political spectrum are skeptical of by and large. And at the very least, we all look around and you see all these crazy politicians that just want power, but to the extent it makes them feel cool, versus Donald Trump, who just wants power, pure and simple, and doesn't care what he's like this monster that all he cares about is power, and he does not care about the things he needs to crush on the way there, and how cynically he needs to wield people's cynicism in order to destroy things that I would argue are good for America. And so when he says make America great again, that there was never a time in America where the things he's advocating for, like critical race theory aside, these weird initiatives to say no, all these horrible, cynical things. There was never a design for America to do what Donald Trump plans to do. And that's horrifying.
It's horrifying. And it's also like the other side has completely politicized this and calling Milley like the deep state. Like top military brass is the deep state? I'm sorry, no. They work for you. They're trying to keep general order in the country so we have a country.
And meanwhile, you got Steve Bannon going out and talking about shock troops and planning to essentially, he is saying he wants to create a deep state. Like when you listen to Bannon's podcast, he says, all right, we're gonna have 4,000 people that I put together. And those people, we're not going to tell you who they are and what their names are, but they have vowed secretly to forward, use any power and tricks at their disposal to eliminate what makes America great, is my take on it. But on him to eliminate all the things that are standing in the way of us white people taking over America and protecting our ownership of all stuff. And it's terrifying.
Yeah, he hears Reichstag moment and he's like, oh yeah, hell yeah, I want my Reichstag moment. What? Oh, that's bad? No.
He's using terms that the Reichstagers used in like step 2 after the fake, constitutional crisis, for lack of a better term. And that crisis that they still are talking about, the manufactured crisis, is this concept that the election was stolen. And they keep harping.
I think that this story for me, because Christopher Miller testified a while ago, but I think these authors of this piece have really put it in stark clarity, just how close we were to a coup and sort of like lacing everything together, kind of weaving the narrative. And one thing that I didn't know, that Christopher Miller was supposed to be a loyalist, right? He was supposed to actually support whatever Trump wanted to do. And instead, he was the last line of defense against his worst impulses. So if it hadn't been Miller, if he had just promoted anyone random, or in fact, the Pentagon went through a major shift in those months leading up to January 6th. So like everything was set, the stage was set. Trump was just banking on the fact that Miller would call out the National Guard, but they would be in support of his people. In fact, I think that's what the plan was. Instead, and this is Christopher Miller, he testified, he says plainly, there was absolutely no way I was putting US military forces at the Capitol, period. Now, as someone who's been in a lot of protests, who's been prevented from entering buildings peacefully, there are ways to put more defense mechanisms in front of the Capitol building that aren't the National Guard. Like, you could have multiple barricades. You can have like, riot cops. You can have, bike cops. They love their bike. They love that netting. My God. That being said, I've never actually charged police in battle gear and like bear mace and pitchforks, you know what I mean? And American flags, using them as weapons. So I don't know, you know what I mean? I'm ignorant, I guess, of really what it takes. But, and I think that, Brett, you're right. Like this is the entire point is actually the lesson that a lot of these fascists are taking is clean house earlier and make sure you get someone like Christopher Miller on your side. Make sure the Secretary of Defense is with you, and make sure all the generals, the ones who quote unquote misbehave, they're purged. So yeah. Yeah.
And there's proof of it. Like you hear Donald Trump afterwards, like very soon after the beginning of his presidency going, I shouldn't have gone with someone who would recuse themselves as attorney general.
Yes.
Like I should never have done that. I should have gone with a loyalist. I thought I could have it both ways. I thought this guy was a big enough sycophant, but he just wasn't a psychopath. That's a problem.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.